Okay, folks, we're going to begin. Good evening, everyone. Good evening, Selectman Gito. Nice to see you. Good evening, everybody. We're going to tonight conduct a public information session regarding water, sewer, and solid waste. Before we begin, I'd ask you all to join me in standing for the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America, to the republic which stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Thank you. Please be seated. I'd like to begin by having each member of this panel introduce themselves, and then I'll do a brief introduction, and then we'll get right into the presentation. To my right, let's begin there, Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Town Manager. Paul Jaffoon, Public Works Superintendent. I'll be speaking on the solid waste presentation, the last presentation of the evening.
Thank you, Paul. Mr. Tisdale.
Mark Tisdale, Director of Development Services, Town Engineer.
Mr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Coulter. Rowe, Town Accountant.
Mr. McNulty.
Phil McNulty, Stoughton Water and Sewer Superintendent.
Mary Jane.
Mary Jane Martin, Assistant Town Council.
The brains of the operation. Thank you. And I'm Tom Coulter, your Town Manager. Just some brief remarks to begin with. I want to talk about the process, and I'd like to talk about what we want to accomplish. This evening, we're going to give you factual presentations on our water department, our sewer department, and our solid waste division. The water department and the sewer department are enterprise funds, and Bill is going to speak to what an enterprise fund is for the general public. As I look around the room, I know all of you know what an enterprise fund is, but we want the general public to understand that. We're going to go through the presentations on each of them separately. Bill is going to ask you, I'm going to ask you, all the presenters are going to ask you along the way, do you understand what we're presenting? I'm sorry, Mr. Gito, we should have got that for you. It's important before we go to the next chart, if you don't understand, raise your hand. Not for questions, but that you don't understand. And then we're going to clarify it even clearer. At the end of the presentation, we're going to go back to chart number 1 for that presentation, for any questions you have on that chart. Now, there's a small number of people in the room. You represent 30,000 people who are watching. So if you have a question, I'm sure somebody at home has the same question. So feel free to ask that question. What are these public information hearings? Mark and I, the entire staff of Town Hall and our Board of Selectmen are 100% committed to sharing good information, openness, and transparency. Those aren't just words with us. Those aren't lofty goals. That's our commitment to the town. So just as we spoke about the healthcare crises, we spoke about the fire department last month, separating facts from fiction and sharing good information. Tonight, we're going to talk about 3 departments that all in are probably $3 million a year underwater. What does that mean? They have structural deficits. Don't quote me on the number. We're going to give you exact numbers. They have been underfunded, and we call that a structural deficit, whereby expenses have exceeded revenues for a decade or more. What we're here to do tonight is not to cast votes, not to come up with remedies. Our goal here this evening is to share with you factual information about 3 things on each of these departments. The first one is, where are we? The second one is, how did we get here? And the third question is, where do we go from here? In 2 weeks, on May 2nd, there'll be a public meeting conducted and posted by the Select Board. At that meeting, we will go through the same presentation again, but we will also provide a staff recommendation to the board for potential measures that we can take to solve these problems. The board will then deliberate and take a vote on whatever rate changes there will be to the water department, the sewer department, and the solid waste department. Again, we're not here this evening to talk about solutions. We're developing those solutions, the staff is, so that we're able to make recommendations to the Select Board. They are the decision-making policy body of our town. And we will give them well-thought-out, analyzed, quantitative recommendations on the budget, and also recommendations on each of these departments of operational changes and policies that the staff recommends making in order to fix this problem. So the first chart we're going to go to in your handout is for the water department. As you can see, the first chart says, again, where are we, how did we get here, and where do we go from here? One ground rule. I know sometimes in Stoughton, it's very important that we have somebody to blame. That's the only part of Stoughton so far I don't like. We're not going to blame anybody. We are where we are. Just hard decisions have to be made. Hard decisions are very hard to make in the town of Stoughton. So what we're going to do tonight is give you some insight as to what the consequences are of not making tough decisions. Just like in business, if you put off an expense, it eventually comes and finds you, and it's typically higher than the expense that you put off. The second question we're going to ask is, how do we get here? What decisions or non-decisions by the people who occupied that office, excluding my partner to my left, what decisions or non-decisions resulted in the situation we're in each department? Where do we go from here? The last chart is going to lay out where we're going from here to address and resolve these problems. I'll end my introduction on the water department and turn it over to Bill by saying to you that failure is not an option. That means indecision is not an option. The consequence of not making a decision, and this is a very important point, is that we subsidize these departments through our tax base. And there are lots of consequences associated with doing that. A, our taxes are higher than they should be. I think we'll all agree on that. Because we're charging user fees. We're not funding those departments, and therefore we're covering it through the tax base, number one. Number two, it decreases our liquidity. We are at a AA bond rating right now. In order to maintain a AA bond rating, you have to maintain 20% liquidity, a percentage of your cash versus your overall budget. We're at 17%, which means we're at significant risk of our bond rating being reduced by the bonding agencies. If our bond rating is reduced, our cost of money skyrockets. If our cost of money skyrockets, then our cost of borrowing skyrockets, and that cost is incorporated into our operating budget. Do you see how the problem just keeps perpetuating itself? And it gets worse and worse and worse. As your town manager, I need to say to you, we need to fix these problems. Kicking the can down the road will have no longer long-term consequences. Kicking the can down the road are going to have very short-term and very serious consequences. Last example, we're in budget negotiations with all of our unions. Stoughton does not pay its employees anywhere near the average. For that reason, we can't recruit or retain people. We lost our veterans agent this week. We can't keep people. We're 10 people short in the fire department and the police department. Why? We can't afford to pay them even at the average because we're not making the hard decisions. So again, these problems perpetuate themselves. They don't go away. And usually when we face up to them, they end up costing us more than they would have cost us had we done it at the time. So with that, I'm going to turn the presentation on the water department over to, I believe, Mr. Rowe. Is that you the first up, Bill? And he's going to explain what a structural deficit is, and then we're going to get into detail about the water department. Thank you for listening. Mr. Rowe.
Thank you, Mr. Calter. I am Bill Rowe, town accountant. So
So I want to talk a little bit about budgets. First, about enterprise funds. So an enterprise funds is a business-type enterprise. It operates with revenues that pay for the services provided and expenses to provide those services. And the main thing is the service. We're not it's not a profit-making agency. The primary responsibility, it is a governmental business-type enterprise, but the primary responsibility is to provide a service to the users, to the people that use the operation. So just simply saying you have a budget, it's voted by town meeting, you have estimated revenues, have to match. We have to submit a balanced budget to the state if we're going to send out tax bills.
Excuse me, Bill, may I interrupt, please? Professor, we've watched you in action so many times, and you're very dynamic when you're close to the crowd and standing up. I'd love to have you stand up and speak.
Absolutely.
We call him the professor, and he's so much more relaxed when he's standing and speaking.
Maybe I studied too much French in college, that's why it's coming out a little.
Thank you, Bill.
Yeah. So we have a budget. What happens if the revenues don't equal the expenses? Well, then we have what's called a structural deficit. You hear that a lot of times in municipal accounting, municipal government. Basically, simply put, a structural deficit means that your current revenues aren't equaling your budgeted expenses. So what happens? Well, you got to balance the budget, so you got to find the money somewhere else. So what you have to do is to dip into your reserves to balance the budget. Well, what if you don't have enough reserves to cover the budget along with the estimated revenues? Then it has to be subsidized by the general fund. It has to be subsidized by the taxpayer. And that subsidy has to be voted by town meeting as well. You can't just let it ride and send it in. No, it has to be actually voted by the town meeting. So, so just a few examples, simple examples. We have estimated revenues. The first example, we have estimated revenues of $4 million. We have budgeted expenses of $4 million. Structural deficit is 0. No reserves used and no general fund subsidy. All zeros. Next example. So we have estimated revenues of $3,500,000. We have budgeted expenses of $4 million. We have a structural deficit of $500,000. So to balance that budget, we have to use $500,000 of reserves. So our budget deficit, when it goes to the state, is 0. But the structural deficit is $500,000. Why? Because the current revenues don't equal the current expenses. Next slide, Mary Jo. So again, another example, the estimated revenues of $3,500,000. The budget expenses are $4,250,000. So now we have a structural deficit of $750,000. We're using $500,000 worth of reserves, which are commonly referred to in enterprise accounting as retained earnings. That's what the state refers to them as. So in order to make it balance, we had the general fund, the taxpayers have to kick in $250,000 as a subsidy. Everybody with me so far in those examples? Just general examples. So, well, you might say, well, Bill, why don't you just raise up your estimate on your revenues to balance the budget? The Department of Revenue will not let you estimate more revenues than you collected in your prior fiscal year. Not billed, actually collected, actual cash collections, unless you have justification for it as to why you're doing that. Written justification. Okay, I guess I'm ready for the next slide, Mary Jane. Another side effect, if you have a structural deficit, I won't go into this too deeply, but basically there's a borrowing limit. Each community has a borrowing limit. It's 5% of what's called your equalized valuation, the value of the properties in town. And right now it's around $173 million that's left. If we have a debt exclusion, we have the fire station, we have the high school. Those are outside of that 5% evaluation limit. It's called borrowing outside the debt limit. Enterprise fund borrowings, water and sewer. Those are outside the debt limit as well, unless why? Unless the community cannot certify that rates and charges are sufficient to cover the expenses, in which case they are inside of the debt limit. So all these water and sewer borrowings that we're doing now, that goes against the $172 million instead of being outside. That's it, Mary Jane. So how are we looking with the Water Enterprise Fund? All right, so this is just a simple profit and loss statement or income statement, whatever you want to call it. We've got 3 columns here. We've got the fiscal 21 actual expenses and revenues.
Excuse me, Bill?
Yep.
So, folks, we went from an example on structural deficits to what Bill's going to cover now, which are real numbers for the water department. Thank you, Bill.
Thank you. So if you look at the fiscal 2021 actual, we have revenues minus expenses. We have a structural deficit right in the middle there in the first column of $451,765. So how do we balance that budget? Well, we took $1,455,689 from retained earnings, which is our reserves, and we had a state agency paid a little bit of money towards us. So in actuality, we had a surplus. But how do we have that surplus? We had to use a lot of reserves to balance that operation. In column 2, fiscal 22, the same thing. The fund lost almost $1,100,000. Spent more than it took in. So because we had that situation in fiscal 22, remember I said you can't estimate more revenues than you collected in the prior fiscal year. Well, the last prior fiscal year was fiscal 22. So you notice that the revenues in the top section there, they're exactly the same for fiscal 24. The budget that's been presented to town meeting is in the expense section. That subtotal is $5,924,558. So that's a deficit of $1,289,836. So we've got to find the money to balance the budget somehow. We have 0 retained earnings. There are no retained earnings in the water fund. We have what's called the MWRA Infrastructure Fund. Now, the MWRA Infrastructure Fund was set up by the legislature. It's Chapter 106 of the Acts of 2006, which allows the town to collect money from what are called tax increment financing agreements from developers. And it allows the town to put that money into a special fund, and it allows the select board to transfer that money to the water department without appropriation by town meeting. That's a special legislation that was set up to do that. So next slide. So this is just a summary compared to the examples that we had before. We've got estimated revenues of $4,634,722. Budget expenses of $5,924,558. We have a structural deficit of $1,289,836, and we're counting on the select board to transfer the difference to the water fund. And if you look at the last sentence on that page, that fund, that infrastructure, MWRA infrastructure fund is not unlimited. It's going to run out. Most of these tax increment financing agreements are expiring. Right now, we have a balance of just over $3,370,000. So we're taking a little over a third of that for fiscal '24 to balance the budget. Next slide, Mary Jo. Okay, and this is, I'm going to let Tom I believe would like to speak on this.
Thank you,
This
Bill.
is a little bit of history.
And that's exactly what it is, folks. When the title is, How Did We Get Here? There were very prudent decisions made over a decade ago by the leaders of your town. One of the primary decisions had to do with water distribution. If you look at the right side of those numbers, Stoughton's dependence on MWRA, you can see that the amount of dollars we were spending on MWRA water went up every year, 628, 700, 758, 932, 1.1, 1.4 million. First of all, the costs were running out of control and they were unsustainable. But to perpetuate that problem even further, the infrastructure, the underground water lines that deliver that water to us, were at full capacity. We couldn't pump any more water through that existing distribution system. And a conscious decision needed to be made as to whether the millions and millions and millions of dollars were going to be spent on upgrading an infrastructure so that we could take more money from, more water from MWRA. The decision was made at that time for the water department to start generating its own water sources and deliver it inside of Stoughton. So that decision was made about a decade ago, about 2015. If you look at the following 10 years, the dollar usage of water we took from MWRA has consistently gone down. That's a good thing. Stoughton made an investment in the future. That's the good news. The bad news is that capital investment carries with it a $2.2 million a year debt service. So the impact on that enterprise fund, Bill, please correct me if I'm wrong.
Do you want to go back to that previous slide there?
Yes, please do.
P&L, Mary Jane? See the debt service on the P&L there? The one before that, I think. Yeah. So you see the debt service, about in the middle of the page there, it's the last
This is
item on
good.
the expense line. Oops, wrong one. So for fiscal '22, it's $2,374,000. Fiscal '21. Fiscal '22, it's $2,436,000. So that's almost half the water department's budget. But why is that? That's an investment. That is an investment in water mains, well rehab. So we're paying for it now. But in the long run, it should work out. But you can see why we're having the problems now, because we have to pay the interest and principal on those bonds.
And
And then we have PFAS coming up as well, which is a new bond. So
I know what Phil is going to say now, and we're going to get there. He's been dying to say this all day. If you look at that column, 1.14, and if you look at the dependence, now the decline in MWRA expenses, you may say, why don't you have it? Why do you still have a deficit? You've saved almost $1 million from MWRA. Well, the debt service is $2.2 million. So it's a negative $1.2 million impact on your operating statement. Now, the reason I said in the beginning it's prudent, and Bill just restated it, long-term, citizens of Stoughton will look back and see the prudence of that decision, because we had no cost control over MWRA pricing and MWRA expenses. When this debt is paid down, and we're generating and distributing our own water, which we have been for the last decade, we'll begin to enjoy the benefits of that long-term investment. Unfortunately, and again, I'm going to repeat what Bill said, in the short term, it's a net negative $1 million+ because the debt service is higher than the savings we're getting from MWRA. Now look to the left. This is the second part of the problem on how we got here, because that's the title, How Did We Get Here? On the left side, you can look at the increases every year. 2.5%, 3%. Go all the way down to 2020, a decrease of 5%. And it was during COVID when people were really struggling, and your select board heard you about the difficulties. But now go to the next 3 years, 0, 0, 0, as our costs were skyrocketing because of debt service and a number of other factors. The net result of that is we have, Bill, an overall structural deficit for 2023 or 2022 of what? $1.2 million? Yeah. Approximately. Yeah, $1.1 million, $1.2 million. That's where we are today. The public hearing in 2 weeks is going to present recommendations for remedies to the select board for them to make a policy decision. Phil, is there anything else on this chart you want to speak to?
That's good coverage, but I would just add that in terms of the town as a whole, in developing the town commercial, residential, industrial, we didn't have the water to approve those projects. So somewhere in the background of all this discussion is those projects probably could not get approved. So not only is it a good decision to invest in the water infrastructure, but also investing in the town as a whole. So.
And I want to go back, I've been here, 20 years now. Right before I came, I'm sure a lot of you residents will remember this. We had a moratorium on commercial industrial development. Why? Because we didn't have the water supply. So what do? We joined up with the MWRA for emergency connection. It cost us $5.6 million to join that. But we were able to get significantly large retail developers to come in. Now we're in the same situation. We almost didn't have enough capacity for a lot of new developments to come in. And that's why Phil is investing in the rehab of the wells and the water mains, so we can be allowed to have the capacity to accommodate these new developers coming in. That's it.
Well said, Bill. Bill, the next chart is yours. Mary Jane? Any questions on that chart? Would you like us to go back, or do you understand that chart? Dave? I made a mistake, Anthony.
Dave Lurie, Precinct 6. The time in which you used retained earnings, you added an extra $1 million above what you needed, so you ended up with a surplus in -- correct?
Oh, where are you looking, David?
Oh, I'm sorry.
21?
This is on the Water Enterprise Fund, Where Are We slide.
No? Okay. Yep.
So why did we take that much in retained earnings instead of in '21 raising the water rates on the town in the same year? It looks like they just said, let's leave the water customers, I'll call them customers, instead of using retained earnings to do the same thing.
Well, it's a difficult decision. We were going through COVID at the time, and the select board doesn't want to burden the residents of the town, which is understandable. And the town has every right to subsidize these enterprise funds in lieu of raising rates, but it has consequences. Eventually, it's going to result in cuts of services to public safety, education, human services. But they're perfectly within the right to not raise the rates and use their reserves to balance the budget.
Oh,
But now it's catching up with us.
No, I'm just asking why. I understand that they could. That wasn't the premise of my
Understanding
question.
why they didn't want to raise the
What was
rates?
the logic? You're saying it's COVID and people feeling.
Well, I wasn't a selectman, but they didn't want to burden the residents with additional rates. at higher rates. That's basically the reason.
Yeah, you mentioned the infrastructure fund, the MWRA,
Yep.
1,289,000. Does that have anything to do with the TIF agreements that rolled off?
That has, no, not the ones that rolled off. That's TIF money that we've accumulated over the years.
Okay, so it
They,
created a pot of money.
Right.
But don't we have $1 million, almost $1 million, 900 and change year over year that came off as new growth in year one?
right.
And subsequent years. So what's going to happen?
That's
with-
right. That's why I mentioned that fund was unlimited. There's $3,370,000 left.
Well, that's what's left, but isn't it true that you're getting a new 950 or more every year coming out of the TIF and available for, as new growth?
We expect that to be zero in say, fiscal 25, 2026, because all those TIFs are expiring. All those are
They
expiring.
expired, but doesn't that make it available as new money that's coming into
New money for the general fund to be appropriated,
Yeah.
yes, by town meeting.
That's right.
Not contributed to this.
Well, okay, but in essence, the amount that you're saying that comes out of general fund is being fed also from a source that had to do with the water fund off of TIF agreements. If you play it out, I mean, it's not a direct line because everything goes to the general fund first. But if it comes off a TIF, it's a new source of money that's coming in other than just levy, other sources, et cetera.
Well,
et cetera.
it's property tax revenue, that's all it is.
It's property tax
Yeah, property
revenue
tax
that's
revenue,
realized as new
which is
growth.
which is general fund money. That can't be used for the water fund without
No,
appropriation.
of course,
Yeah.
without appropriation and so
Right,
forth.
yeah.
All right, thank you.
Yep.
Folks, if you don't mind, what we're doing at this stage is if you want something clarified. At this stage, we're taking questions if you need clarification, and then we're going to go back into each chart to take your questions. And the reason we're doing that is so there's continuity of the presentation, but we're in no hurry. We're going to go back to the first chart, and you can ask questions on every chart. Okay, so is this for clarification, Mark?
It is.
Great.
Yeah, and I apologize.
We went over the ground rules before you and Dave walked in. I'm sorry. I
No, it's okay.
forgot
Mark
to realize that.
Semanian at 5 Low Avenue. And just for clarification purposes, looking at this chart and the previous chart that was up, it looks like we had in fiscal 21, a $451,000 deficit. And that was closed through retained earnings. Am I correct in that, Bill?
Yeah, we balance the budget through retained earnings.
Right. And then the following year, FY22, it was $1,085,000, call it 086. And we used some retained earnings and some MWPAT. Can somebody clarify what
That's,
that is?
we have a bond through the Mass Clean Water Trust. It's called an MCWT now. And they actually pay the debt service on behalf of the water fund. And then we have to show it as revenue because for the portion they're paying. That's all that is. It's not,
So
it's not
a
actual
bond-
cash.
It's like an equity loan.
Yeah, it's
to help my
like an
simple-
in-kind
Yeah.
contribution by the state.
Okay.
Yeah.
And this year, we have $1,289,000
For fiscal,
deficit.
that's for fiscal '24 for next year's budget.
That's
Yeah.
correct, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Oh, yeah. Where's 23?
Well, we didn't include '23 because that's only half a year, so,
Gotcha.
yeah.
And this is essentially because we're not covering our costs. Is that a fair statement?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. I noticed that this year it's been pulled out of the infrastructure fund for the MWRA. How does that affect us in the long term with that fund? How much money is there? What kind of an impact will this 1.2 have?
So the select board can use that money in the infrastructure fund to balance the water budget. In years past, we've done an annual transfer. We haven't needed to do one because we've had retained earnings balances the last few years. But, for fiscal '24, the select board will have to do it. We'll usually wait until, before they do the transfer, we could either do the transfer now, or we could wait to see how the operations end up at the end of '23, and they could do it at that point.
See if there's any surpluses.
Yeah, exactly, exactly,
And use
yeah.
the surplus if possible.
Yeah, but we have time. We have time to make that transfer until we submit the budget to the state.
Okay.
So-
And Tom, you said you were taking questions later, more generalized?
Yes, Mark, what we're going to do, we're taking points of clarification now.
Yeah.
And at the very end, we're in no hurry. We're going to go back to chart 1. If there's no questions, we go right on to chart 2. If there's no questions, right on to chart 3.
We're in a hurry because we got to be at the caucus at 7 o'clock.
Okay.
But thank you.
Thank you.
For the clarification, Bill. Tom.
You're welcome. Okay. So I think water connection fees is Phil's. Yep. Slide 12.
Oh, yeah, so I guess we're done with where are we, and I'm going to get into how did we get here a little bit. So, okay, so the first item there is connection fees. So you might say, what are connection fees? That things like charging for the meter, charging for a tap, 6-inch, 8-inch, 1-inch tap, depending on the development or service. So as stated at the end of this line here, it really hasn't changed in the last 20 years plus. So as we all know, inflation is going up, and we continue to flatline on our charges there. So that's, number one as part of the problem. The second item there is reduced system development fees. System development fees are, I kind of call them join the club fees, similar to what Bill was describing. When we joined MWRA, they charged us $4 or $5 million, whatever it was. Nothing to do with construction of the station or the water main, but just to join their club. So that's system development fees are more than join the club. They're like, those funds are intended to be used in a enterprise situation as, the infrastructure isn't going to last forever. So those fees are intended to be put away, and instead of borrowing all the time, have that pot of money there to fix your infrastructure. So those fees have actually been, they've been pretty level for the last 20 years as well, the 2,500. And now they're actually reduced another 500 on top of that. So that's the second problem. The third item was really just a discussion with the selectmen, who are also the water and sewer commissioners, to give a 3-month moratorium on fees, just to encourage residents to join, have them in the club, since we, have developed the water and have the water to expand, if you will. And, there were probably a few customers came out of that. Mostly that was, I think personally, I was hoping that some of these developments that went on in the 80s and 90s, who are all on wells, because there was a moratorium, hopefully some of their, not that their wells would go bad, but they would decide to switch over to the town instead of using their wells. The last item there, number 4, is if those of you who are familiar with the Schmood district, it's basically a big line around the center of the town. I think the idea is to encourage development in the center of town in some way, but added to the things that we're already dealing with, their fees were waived to a substantial amount, and that's not helping the situation. So. Next is the Sewer Enterprise Fund.
So for sewer, we're starting off with a profit and loss income statement again. So 21, we did well. We actually collected 514,637 more than we spent. So that was good. That was a good year. In fiscal '22, we didn't do so well. We spent a little bit more than we collected, $178,850,000. But we had a lot of retained earnings, and we needed some capital. So in that bottom section there where it says other financing sources, we transferred to our capital projects fund $600,000. So we ended up and then plus there was a general fund subsidy of $91,782. So the sewer fund was, you could see it was starting to struggle now. So we ended up with an operating deficit overall, even after retained earnings, of $205,987. So that leads us into the budget for fiscal '24. So in the middle section, town meeting is being presented a budget of $8,764,214. The estimated revenues, we can't go over the 2022 actual, so those match what the 2022 actuals are, $7,437,276. So the sewer fund has a structural deficit of $1,326,918 for fiscal '24. $1,326,000, so that's a big deficit. We had certified retained earnings or reserves by the state in the bottom, looking at the bottom section now, of $388,387. Not enough to cover the operating deficit. So we're asking town meeting to fund a general fund subsidy of $938,551, almost $1 million out of taxpayer funds. So, pretty substantial. So here's just a summary, which is similar to the examples we had previously. The estimated revenues, $7,437,000. Budgeted expenses, $8,764,214. Structural deficit, current revenues minus current expenses of $1,326,000. So we're going to use all of our reserves, $388,000, 100% of it, plus a general fund subsidy, taxpayer subsidy, to balance the budget. So as you can see, it's really not good news for either fund. Both funds are struggling. Next. This for you, Phil, I believe.
Can we go back a slide? Bill, I just wanted to point out that, the 1.3 is a big number, but if we look on the, back one more. Yeah. 1, 2, 3, 5 lines down, the MWRA assessment is up from 5.4 to 5.8, almost 5.9, so that's a big hit right there. I'm just trying to call out some of the bigger items here. And then the debt service from 400,000 up to 860. So combine those, add up to around 800 of the 1.3. So I'm just focusing on those a little bit as part of the reason.
Yeah, so what is the MWRA assessment? So the MWRA, we send our sewage to Boston through the MWRA system. And they base a flow on each of the communities that they serve, base an assessment on the flow of each of the communities they serve. And that's for 3 prior calendar years, plus a census of the town. There's a formula that they use. So they look at all the communities, look at what their budget is going to be, and then they allocate, split up the assessments among the member communities. And they do that each year. So we have to estimate what that's going to be. That $5,887,949. I understand they're going through some changes. That's a preliminary number. But that's more than, well, almost, is it more? Yeah, it's almost 2/3 of his budget. I mean, look at what he has for operating. He has the salaries for expenses in the first line, then the assessment, then the other expenses, $650,000. So that's, the MWRA is 2/3 of our sewer budget. So you can't get around it. It's a fixed cost. So, Mark.
Thank you, Bill. Just a quick question. You're absolutely right. We can't get around the assessment. That is what it is. The salary increases were relatively modest. The only question I had is the 400 plus, almost 450 in debt service increase. Where is that coming from? Was that one of the projects that we approved
Yes.
at town meeting?
Yeah.
Could you tell us which
Most
one?
of it's like Park Street Sewer, it's like 260,000. That's going to be paid by, 25% will be paid by betterments, but the town has to eat the other 75%.
Yep.
So,
And there was a little bit of a bump in other expenses. Do you know what that was from, or? I mean, it's 160,000.
yeah, I mean, there's a lot of it's, Phil can expand on that, I'm sure a lot of it's inflation.
Phil,
Chemicals have
is
gone
it
up.
basically an inflationary, or were there some needed purchases that had to be done?
Mark, I can tell you chemical prices more than doubled in the last 3 years alone.
You think the other expenses are primarily chemicals, Phil?
We'd have to look at the budget detail, but.
Yeah, I'm not going to hold you to it, but,
Yeah.
I mean, I'm trying to get a sense as to where the big increases were.
No, I mean, I'm kind of looking at the next line, the indirect costs, some of that is health insurance, but I'm not quite certain what's in other expenses built.
Yeah, the indirects, there's also really nothing, and it's a relatively modest increase, but
Yeah, so
I'm just picking on the bigger,
Yeah.
jumps.
You're right. Might be a good time to explain what the indirect costs are.
Can we,
Mm-hmm.
can we first just go to the next chart and then come back to the indirect
Sure.
costs?
Yep.
Yeah, just for, Bill, stay up there, please.
Yep.
If you look at the indirect costs, if you look at the next page, Mary Jane, it's page number, it's the next one in order. Yeah, that one there. Stay with me for a second. This can be complicated. If you look at 2015, and let's look at that 10-year trend. 2015, our MWRA charge was $4.7 million. And last year, in FY23, it was 5.4. 4.7, to 5.9, a $1.2 million difference. It's also interesting to point out that 6 out of those 9 years, now if you look at the left column, we had 0% increases during that time.
Yeah.
So if you look at the increase in debt service for what we believe were very prudent investments and will serve the town of Stoughton residents really well in future downstream years, you're looking at an increase, substantial increase in debt service, a substantial increase in MWRA direct charges for sewage. In 6 out of the last 10 years, we had 0% increase in rates.
Right, and I think that's sort of what I'm grinding at here. A resident, things are going up, okay? We all get that. But for it to go up 3 or 4 or 5% a year, okay, it's manageable. You can sort of budget it. We're going to get whacked with a substantial increase now. That's not doing the residents any favors. And you had mentioned earlier, well, we didn't want to hurt the residents. We're hurting.
We are where we are, Mark.
I know, and I understand that. And
so
it's
I
not
would-
on you, Tom,
No,
because
I'm
you weren't
not
here.
taking it
But
personally. So what I would really hope and expect is that you come to the meeting on May 2nd,
oh, I'll be there.
because there will be a room full of people who will say, do not increase our rates. And there are real consequences.
This is the consequence.
When you defer payments, you pay much more 10 years later. We're proving that right here.
Yep.
We have to make revenues meet our expenses.
And
Agreed 100%.
And
Thank you.
again, there's no law, as I mentioned before, there's no law that says we have to do that. It's up to you, the residents. You have the absolute right to subsidize these funds
In your tax.
through the select board with your taxes, rather than raise rates. You have the absolute right to do that. But it has consequences. Eventually, it's going to hit services, public safety, education. It's going to cut into that. Because there's only so much money that we can, 2.5% on property taxes just isn't enough. That's pretty much eaten up by our fixed costs. So,
I got here a little, Dave Lurie, Precinct 6. I got here a little late, so I missed the part where you can't do the rules. I missed the rules. But I just want to say thank you for doing the presentation. This informational session, long overdue. We should have been doing this back in those years, 2015 all the way through. And I hope it becomes a regular practice within the town that you do, that somebody, if not yourself, continues with as a legacy that we continue with. Thank you very much.
thank you.
Dave, thank you for that comment. I failed to make a comment at the introduction, Dave, before you leave, because I know you're a town meeting member. Just a message to all town meeting members, your books were hand-delivered to your homes today, so if you haven't been home yet, when you get there, you'll find them in your door. It's the first year we've tried to do that. We saved $2,800 in expenses, and it gave an opportunity for some of our police officers, some of our town meeting staff. Phil met some people today, Mark met some people today, I met some people today, and it was a real pleasure to meet some of the town meeting members. So if you haven't been home yet, or for those who are listening, if you haven't been home, your books are in your door. Thank you. Thank you, folks. Thank you. And David, thank you for the work of the Finance Committee in preparing an extraordinary document. Thank you.
Okay. Are we done with this slide, or? Yeah. Mr. Gito.
The numbers from 2018 on, in the percent change should be but you can,
Okay.
think that there are other documents.
Okay, Mr. Gito says that from 2018 on, the increase should be, percentage should be 0. I know there were small increases in 18, 19, and 20. But no, they haven't been,
Differently on a different other document.
they did, oh, that's possible, yeah.
Proceed, Bill.
Excellent. I'll let Phil take over on this one.
I'd just go back to that last one once more. Just, I guess the overall thing here to show is that our rates are relatively flat for the last 8, 10 years. And meanwhile, as much as we do on the I&I side, MWRA is going to get what Bill described as a flow share. They're going to apply a cost to Stoughton because our flow share of their overall operation is 1%. And you know, other than fighting I&I, we really don't have control over that. So their costs are going up, and our rates aren't keeping up with even their costs, never mind inflation. So. Next slide is just showing the volume of customers we have on the water and sewer side. It's a question that's frequently asked, and those numbers apply moving forward to anything you multiply, generate by. So where do we go from here is the question. We've covered how did we get here and where are we, and now it's where do we go from here. So financially, completing the fixed network meter reading system. Older meters read slower. Slower meters record less volume equals less revenue. So we have roughly 58% of the residential meters to complete. So that would be the first order of business, is get those meters replaced. And we'll realize other benefits besides financial, but that's the main thing is financially, we would capture lost revenue there. As stated here, some of the meters go back to the 80s, and the rule of thumb in the meter world is to replace your meters around 10, 12 years old. So the older they get, the slower they read, and the more revenue you lose. Second item here is labor. The fixed network system will populate to a clean database and be more compatible with Munis, therefore eliminating the need to spend time formulating a spreadsheet for 9,000 customers and make sure the decimal points are all in the right place, and so that, you know, this couple of weeks of personnel time to develop that.
Pause for one question from Peter.
Sure.
Peter?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I have to go
Thank you,
to
Phil.
another meeting.
Yes. Go right ahead, Peter.
But what I like to say about these water meters, this is probably the third or fourth meters that we've replaced over the last, I don't know, 25 years. And every time they say we're going to save money and make money, and I never get an answer on how much we made every time we changed up to newer meters. You don't have to answer now. I'll let you talk about it. But the other thing is, the water main that came from the MWRA, I think at the time they weren't thinking too good. I think they thought about how much we needed then, but they didn't plan into the future, because if they did, the water main be more than big enough. Now, the other thing is, when we put a new sewer in, they made all the people hook into it. The sewer main that's going to Campanelli Drive. A lot of people put in new septic systems before they got there, so they give them a few years they can work on a system, but then they have to hook up to the main in the street. Well, if we can do that with sewers, why ain't we doing that with water? And the ban of water started on new homes and new subdivision was 1972, I think. And the water mains are in, and the services to the property line and the curb caulk. And nobody wants to hook into it because it's too expensive, and if they got sewer in the street, then they don't want to, the whole thing is they don't want to hook up to the water because they're going to pay more on the sewer. So I'm saying, all these homes in these old subdivisions, someplace down the line, they should be made to hook up to the water. I'm going to make a lot of friends here tonight, I can see that. Because, I mean, okay, they don't use town water, but if there's a fire there, it's our hydrants that is doing the work, and so we're not getting compensated for that. So I think that should be looked into, because if we had a few hundred houses hooked up, it might make a difference on your budget, get us out of the red. And to do that, them houses in the most subdivision, they shouldn't be charged for a hookup fee, because that's already been paid on a contract that added all that cost onto the home. So when people bought the home, they already paid for the water main and for the service. So if they want to hook up, it should be a free, except they got to pay for the service from the curb caulk to the into the house. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Bill, could you respond to those questions, particularly the last issue on the hookup? Is that something, as we prepare recommendations, a policy recommendation for the board? We're looking at policies, as you know. Should we be talking about people who have not hooked up as part of that plan?
Yeah, so earlier we talked about a 3-month moratorium, one of the first slides, a couple of slides, to incentivize people to jump over with no join the club fee attached. A particular subdivision that comes to mind is Tanglewood. Pretty much every lot down there is, with the exception of a couple, is on their own on their own well. However, there is a main there with hydrants and service from the main to the curb stop so all that's left to do is go from the curb stop to the house. So yeah, we could waive those fees and have those people join. That's good to go. There's hundreds of houses in there. That's just one subdivision. I know Hunt Drive is similar, and there's others. We have the water. That's not an issue.
So I just added that as number 7. Where do we go from here? I think we need to have a conversation about including that in staff recommendations to the select board in terms of how do we solve the donut hole in this business. So do you want to go through this last chart, or shall I?
So I left off on the billing. A frequently asked question is, can we bill like we bill quarterly now? If the full fixed network reading system was installed and all the meters were changed out, we could bill at any frequency, essentially. The only question would be, how much do we want to pay for the mailings? Because driving around town and, going to someone's house and plugging in the old style meters and getting the reading off of that would be over. The readings would come directly to the office, daily, monthly, weekly, whatever.
So allow me just for a second to put in context the slide you're going through right now, folks at home and folks here. This chart is where do we go from here? And these are some of the remedies that we're studying with Phil's leadership, Bill's leadership, that we're studying as part of our recommendation to the Select Board for the hearing on May 2nd. So the first one, Phil, has to do with meters. Could you repeat that, please?
On the billing?
On the first one, financials.
Well, old meters read slower, so slower meters mean lost revenue. So capturing that lost revenue is number one on the list.
So does everybody realize what that means? The gentleman earlier asked the question about meters. The FinCom has recommended that we not buy more meters. We've metered all of the commercial properties and 40% of the residential. That means that some of those meters that are in homes that are 50 years old and are very inefficient and operating very, very slowly, they're not paying for the sewer that they're disposing of. They're paying at some number much lower. The FinCom has voted against it, as my understanding is, because we haven't been able to quantify how inefficient the remaining meters are, or how efficient the new meters are. That's better said. And I understand that. But the real issue here is we're losing substantial revenue because 40% of our residential meters are operating at a very slow level, so we're not capturing the revenue from all of the homeowners. Is that what the first point is about?
Yes.
Second point.
Just labor on check reads and creating a clean database every billing cycle. There's several weeks spent on each of those items in the field and in the office. That's less to do about capturing, lost revenue, but just more efficiencies in the system, which eventually is going to lead to number 3, the billing. We'd stick with quarterly billing unless there's some reason to move off of that. But really, the fourth item is a huge one because the fixed network reading system, we can detect leaks if a toilet bowl is running, we can pick that up day 2, day 3, rather than day 90 of a complete quarterly billing cycle, which is presently where we are now. So you turn a big problem into a much smaller problem, and eventually water abatements just go away, and we stop losing water unnecessarily.
Phil, before you go to 5? So, folks, it's not only detecting leaks in households and commercial businesses, we now have the technology to identify them real time, so we can address it and solve them. It's the mains and the pipes throughout the distribution system throughout town that Phil has got photographs we're going to show at town meeting that shows the pipe and shows water infiltrating through the pipe into the main. I mean, large volumes of clean water infiltrating into the pipe that we now pay to dispose of with MWRA as dirty water, as sewerage. Would you venture to guess what percentage, just venture to guess, what percentage of water we dispose of with MWRA that was caused by infiltration?
Yeah, well, you slid over to the sewer side. What you're saying is absolutely true.
I'm so sorry.
But I would venture to guess if our demand is 2 million gallons a day, which it is on the average,
I'm sorry.
We get 3 million leaving town, so there's an extra million in the sewer. When I'm talking about these leaks, I'm talking about on the water side.
I was gone for
after
a while,
the
but
meter.
I'm back now.
Not before the meter, but on the homeowner side of the meter, meaning they went to Florida and something froze in their house and it popped and it's running, meaning they got a leaky toilet and didn't realize it's down in the basement, they don't hear it, that kind of thing.
Sorry.
No problem. It's all part of it. So the next item is one we've already mentioned is the commercial side of the meter replacement program is 100% done, and the residential side still needs about 58% remaining. So that would be the first order of business, is to complete that. And we have done some analysis in a couple of different ways. We've had a company who who do this for a living, they replace commercial and residential meters. On the commercial side, what they've found on doing, 20, 30, 40 different cities and towns in Massachusetts, that when they if it costs $3 million, the return on investment on commercial is 1 year.
Phil, can we show that in our town meeting presentation?
It's been, the document is a few years old now, but it doesn't change.
Because the FinCom voted, I think it's 1 versus 12 against this investment. And their reasoning is that we have not yet quantified the savings.
Well, we have, yeah.
So we must bring that
We've given
to
them that
town meeting.
information already, yeah.
So if I could summarize this part, these 7 items, we are getting input from other engineers in addition to Mark and Phil. We're going to calculate the measures that we can take as an action plan to present to the board as our recommendation for managing our costs the most effectively we can. It will be the board's vote or decision as to how many of those recommendations they'll accept. It'll be the board's decision on what rate increase they want to adopt and over how many years they want to lay it in. What we're going to do as a staff, finance, engineering, we are going to make a recommendation as to what we think the best approach is, and then they will take input from this meeting and from that meeting on the public hearing, and they will make a final decision. If you look at the last chart, where do we go from here? Completion of the residential meters is key to our mitigation, and the rate adjustments are key to our mitigation. If we do those two things, my bet is we can solve a substantial amount of this problem. Doing nothing will just exacerbate the problem. Go right ahead. Yes. Phil? Bill.
Thank you, Mr. Coulter. I just wanted to, on the previous slide, on number 2, there's something called MUNIS, M-U-N-I-S. I just wanted to explain for the folks watching that is our financial system. That's what we use to record the town's financial information, keeps the financial records. That's all manual right now. It's not interfaced with the utility billing. So it's all manual entry, very, very, very labor intensive. So if the new meters purport to perform as we believe they will, that will make interfacing a lot more possible. So that's it.
Questions, please? Right up to the microphone. Thank you.
Ed DeFelice, Precinct 6. You got a slide up there about putting no meters, water meters in houses. Now, on the other side, our houses are not metered for sewerage. You guys just pick a number out of the sky and apply it to everybody. For example, I know a lot of people are in the same situation as I am, where you're empty nesters, so to speak. So you don't have, a whole family living there, children, et cetera, et cetera. And there are other people that are in just the opposite. So there's no equity there. Everybody's paying the same amount, whether you say no. There's nothing, unless we can meter sewerage, and we don't meter that, I would not favor replacing water meters. Let's get sewer meters in every house, and let's see what we are really spending or using in the town. We don't know that. We don't have the answer to that. And yet you want to start with new water meters. And I think part of the big problem to the residents is, these taxes are going through the roof. I think, talking to other people, just the real estate taxes, I think from last year to this year, you're talking about 10, 13%. And that's without all these increases that we're talking about tonight. Do we have any enterprise accounts that have a surplus of money?
Do we have what, sir?
Do any of the other townwide enterprise accounts have
Yes.
surpluses?
Cedar Hill.
Cedar Hill. Because some years ago, the nurses had quite a surplus. And what did we do? We rated the surplus that they had, and we used it for other stuff.
Use it for what?
Some of the officials could tell you,
subsidize
but
that department.
They used it for other, I don't know if it was,
They subsidized it to fund the nurses.
no, they took it out and used it for other services.
Is that correct?
Thank you, Mr. Coulter. To the speaker, years ago, there was, the public health enterprise had over 2 million retained earnings.
I'm aware of that.
And so there was a law passed, town meeting authorized a home rule petition to get special legislation to allow the town to use a certain amount of that surplus for general operating expenses.
I recall
It
that.
was never done. It was never done. It was never utilized.
So we-
But the law is on the books.
What I would ask you to understand, and quite honestly, it's the part of the town that I'm not very impressed with, is everybody assumes that something nefarious has been done. When Medicare changed their pricing, we might as well have closed that business, the VNA, because we're not getting paid 30% on the dollar of what we used to get paid when it had a large surplus. So the question before the board is, do we want to continue to subsidize the VNA program to serve our seniors? We recognize we've got a subsidy in that department. We have not used the surplus. We've run it down to close to zero because we're not getting paid by Medicare anymore. Nobody raided it, nobody stole it, nobody took anything away from it. Medicare changed its policies and its pricing structure.
Right.
We are the only VNA within a 40-square-mile area. The question is not how to make that profitable. We will never make it profitable. Other VNA private sector operations are closing their doors. They're going out of business. The question on that department is we spend 50-some-odd million dollars to serve our children, and boy, I'm very grateful we do with our schools. Do we want to subsidize $200,000 a year to serve our seniors that need visiting nurses? When I said it's part of the Stoughton that I don't appreciate, and maybe I'll get beat up for saying that, is people do believe that we used it for other sources. We were accused of using the healthcare trust to balance our budget. Not a dime of that healthcare trust went to anything other than policies. That's why we're having these public hearings, to share good information with people who thirst for it. So that's why we're happy to do it. There was no money used from that trust fund. We've been subsidizing that department with its own retained earnings. And now we're out of money. So now the select board is going to have to make a policy decision. Do we want to continue to provide that service to our seniors that depend on it? Or do we want to close it and not subsidize it? When we have that hearing, I really look forward to hearing from people's input.
Just a general question. What would happen if we eliminated all the enterprise accounts? I mean, there was a time when we didn't have enterprise accounts. What would be the ramifications if we decide, because we're doing a lot of talking tonight about funding these enterprise accounts. What would happen if we said, okay, we're not going to just do enterprise accounts anymore?
You mean just change the accounting designation?
Yeah, because, I mean, they haven't been around forever.
Right.
And so we survived, it seems, for a long time.
They wouldn't have an indirect cost allocation, which in this case is probably $300,000 on water and sewer. Other than how they operate and what our expenses are from MWRA, what our debt service is, none of that's going to change. We can't close down water and sewer.
No, but you can pay it out of the general fund like you do everything else.
Then your taxes will skyrocket. I think I just heard you
Well-
say they're too high.
Well, don't you think they're too high?
Yes, I think it's
I mean,
high
they're very
because
high.
we're subsidizing the enterprise funds. If we shut off the enterprise fund and just incorporate it into the general budget, if we incorporate it into the general budget, all subsidies are going to continue to run through the general budget.
Just
What
closing.
we're talking about is taking it out of the general budget.
Yeah, I'm just asking if that would make sense, that's all.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you
The
should.
expenses won't go away,
Okay. Yeah, for sure.
unless, of course, we get rid of the service.
It seems an overall thing to be considered is that we get into trouble with these things because we spend too much money. Just like you would do at your own house. If you spend too much money, you're going to have a problem. So recently, with all due respect to the town, we went on this Park Street sewer for, I don't know, 7, 8 million, maybe more dollars. And we've got these problems, and we're spending money on a sewer that we don't get much of a return. I
I
think
believe
it's-
that was a town meeting vote.
I know that. I understand that.
That is the legislative body of the town of Stoughton.
I know that. But my point is, before the town meeting, and we know that we have all these problems with water and sewer, yet it would seem to me that our officials should look at all these big expenditures. I mean, we got a school on the horizon that we got to do. And it's like, you have to look at this stuff and see where you can, it's always like, where can we get more money? How about where can we cut?
Once again, there's an assumption by you, sir, that we're not already doing that. We just spent 5 months analyzing, well before I got here, every line item on the operating budget. We've got multiple managers managing multiple departments because we can't afford to replace them in those departments. We've got the IT director managing the assessing department. We've got people that are working 15, 20, 30% under their market rates. Your question, although I know is meant very sincerely, is an insult to us. We just spent 5 months scrutinizing every penny of the budget. Then when we went before the Finance Committee, who again scrutinized every line item in the budget. It's incredible to me how people can assume that we just throw a dart up against the wall and we come up with a budget number.
No, that's
There's
not-
been hundreds of hours doing exactly what you just said should be done. That's all I'll say. Mark's got a comment.
With no disrespect,
This isn't a debate. We're supposed to hear information. We haven't even got to trash, and you're allowing him to just debate.
I'm not debating, but I want to make sure, Mr. Town Manager, I'm not criticizing the people. Be quiet, you'll have your turn.
Not a public hearing.
Ed, after that comment, please be seated.
Okay,
Following that comment, we won't tolerate it. Be seated.
won't tolerate, what did I do?
Anybody to be quiet at a hearing in Town
Well,
Hall.
if you're speaking,
Please be
you
seated.
should have told me that.
Please be seated.
I will, thank you.
Go ahead. Mr. Town, Assistant Town Manager.
All right. I'd like to clarify one point because I think you bring up a great question, Mr. DeFelice. We haven't realized the benefit of investing in that sewer infrastructure for the Park Street sewer. As you know, I'm not a politician. I just kind of tell you how it is from a factual standpoint in my true opinion. For that project, if you remember, the reason why that project was approved by town meeting and endorsed by the selectmen was it will create extra revenue from water, sewer, and new growth. 3 pots of money. So we haven't realized that benefit yet because the sewer project is not online. We're waiting for some back-ordered parts for the pump station. It should be online in September, October-ish. We've already realized new growth because a company stayed in Stoughton, the submarine company that manufactures submarine parts, invested in an 80,000 square foot addition, and we did get a TIF from them on that. So we're already realizing the growth from that. We've had a lot of companies come in, ask when the sewer is going to be available because they're going to tie in right away. We've had a lot of residents come in. So we're going to be getting sewer revenue. We're also going to get water revenue from the better uses that will eventually be in that park. We won't get it next year or the year after, most likely, but that will come with time. So you get the water revenue, the sewer revenue, and new growth because you put a sewer line in a commercial industrial corridor. I just want to clarify that. Thank you. Yep.
Bill.
Just another point of clarification with regard to billing. So the sewer is billed off of the water meters. And as a practical matter, you really can't meter the sewers. You can meter large diameter pipes like 24-inch that leaves town here, based on Manning equations. That has a ultrasonic level sensor and curvature of the pipe, and it's calculated that way. But to do that on every single house is extremely impractical. So that's, sewer meters is not a thing that could happen.
And Phil, they're just not reliable, right? Don't they clog up a lot, and they just don't function like a water meter, right? Because it's not clean water you're dealing with.
Right, there's solids in it, as opposed to water meters.
Cynthia, do you have a question before we move on to solid waste? Then Mr. Gito has one.
I have just a point, if you don't mind.
Go ahead, Mr. Gito.
The other point that was being made was that the
Thanks, Paul.
cost for the,
1 second, Lou.
thanks. Thank you very much. The point was made that an empty nester was different from somebody with a five or six people living in a house. In fact, the water bill comes in with the amount of water used. So that should you should deal with that issue as well when you're thinking about responding to things. Thank you.
Are there any other questions before we move on to solid waste? Okay, is there anybody online that we know of? Oh, it's not streaming, it is streaming live. Okay, thank you. If people could move to their packets for solid waste, please. This is going to be a bit less complicated. Water and sewer is very complicated. Once again, we're going to use the same process. We're going to talk about where are we, we're going to talk about how did we get here, and we're going to talk about where do we go from here. So I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Rowe to go through the financial analysis using the same format. Bill, thank you.
So previous speaker mentioned that what would happen if we eliminated the enterprise fund. So our solid waste operation is not an enterprise fund. It is part of the general fund. What the objective was here was to present what are our comprehensive costs in that fund as if it was an enterprise fund, as if it was a business by itself. And how are we matching up those costs against what we collect. So this is a profit and loss statement, similar to what we had before. We have revenues for fiscal 21 of $1,838,000. We had expenses of $2,586,487. So we have a structural deficit of $748,315. And again, we don't have to worry about a balanced budget in this one because it's not an enterprise fund. We don't have to submit an enterprise fund budget to the state and get it approved. But we wanted to try to show what the comprehensive costs of the operations are. So on the expense side, the first four lines show the direct expenses of our sanitation department within the general fund. And then on the last line, I'm showing indirect costs. Now, what are indirect costs? Indirect costs are costs of running the operation that are paid by different departments. If you want to go to the next slide, Mary Jane, we can go through those. So we have health and life insurance. We have our Medicare tax. We have now fuel for 21 and 22, that was paid for out of the sanitation department. For 2023 and 24, That's actually paid by our fleet maintenance department, a different department. So we're showing that as an indirect cost of 0 for 21 and 22, but budget for 2024, we're estimating, we don't have a actual cost of what that fuel is for 24. What it's going to be, we're estimating that at $49,000. Debt service, we've borrowed money to purchase rubbish packers and refurbish some others. That's $50,125 for 2024. Vehicle insurance, that's paid by our insurance department, not the sanitation department. We estimate that at $10,000. I'm looking at the last column now. The pension liability, we have a pension department, pension contribution that we pay. We're assessed by Norfolk County. So we're estimating what the cost would be for those people that work in the sanitation department. And then we do a couple of allocations, liability insurance, administration, again, as if this were an enterprise fund, just to try to show the residents the comprehensive costs of the operation, not just the sanitation department direct costs themselves. So you can go back, Mary Jane, if you want. So for 2021, if you take the comprehensive approach, we spent $748,000 more than we collected in fiscal 21. Fiscal 22 spent $740,000 more than we collected. And the estimated budget for 2024, again, that's the sanitation department plus the indirect costs and the estimated revenues at the top. That's $943,000. So as you can see, this operation is struggling as well. It's not covering its costs with the current revenues. So, and we'll try to address the solutions on May 2nd. We encourage everybody, if you're listening, to please come to Town Hall for that hearing. Next one, Mary Jane. Next. So I'm going to let our DPW Director, Paul Jaffoon, speak to some of these slides. Very, very important information, a lot of detail, and a lot of good detail and analysis. So I'll let Paul take over.
Thank you, Mr. Rowe. We have 7,206 trash customers in town. As of yesterday, I believe was the last time we pulled the data. 1,554 of those customers receive a 25% discount as their seniors. We tried to break this down as to what each resident or each account pays. As you can see, quarterly, $63.50, and if you're a senior, about $48. Weekly, about $5, about $3.70 if you're a senior. Just for some background information. As most people know, we drive 32 miles each way, 3 times a day, down to West Wareham, I believe, CMAS disposal facility. We average about 9,400 tons a year, and this year the cost of the disposal is just over $80. You can see on the chart it's gone up. Back in 2020 it was about the same price, then it went down, then it's gone up, and it's gone up, I'd say, dramatically from that 2021, just 2 years ago. We also do curbside recycling, in which we bring right across the border here to Brockton. We pick up recycling 4 days a week, just like we do curbside trash. And the average recycling cost for this year so far is about $88 a ton. The charge to the resident is $0. We say it's $0 because I believe when they instituted the curbside rubbish, there was no consideration to recycling, yet we still do it the same number of days and on all of the same routes that we do the curbside rubbish pickup. Here's a little snapshot of how we got here. I believe it was 1986, I believe, when the town started to do its own curbside trash removal. Up until 2002, it was considered part of your taxes. In 2002, the quarterly rate was $42. Since then, it's gone up. It went up, as you can see, these percentages in the right-hand column, modestly. Then it stopped, and the last rate increase was 5 years ago. As we know, the cost of doing any business and/or purchasing anything and inflation has gone up more than 0%. Excuse me. So, how did we get here? There is the fee for limitless curbside pickup is $63 a quarter, and we have historically taken anything and everything that has gone curbside. We do not charge an extra fee for recycling, which, as we previously said, is roughly $87, $88 a ton to dispose of currently. We do not charge any fees for what we call large item pickups, which we do on Mondays. A resident will call the office, schedule a pickup, and we'll pick up a refrigerator, a washing machine, a big piece of furniture, etc. Again, at no additional cost to the customer. Unheard of anywhere else. Couple conclusions here. The town provides limitless trash and recycling services in spite of the fact that it does not own and operate its own state-of-the-art transfer/recycling facility. The town has historically underfunded solid waste services, resulting in long-term structural deficits. The theme of the evening. I'll turn it over to Mr. Coulter in closing.
Thank you, Paul. So where do we go from here? And I remind you, just as with water and sewer, our work now begins, the staff work now begins on further research, a better understanding of the problem, so that we can make an informed recommendation, staff recommendation, on how to balance this fund. Again, not an enterprise fund. Nonetheless, it's a business unit that has a significant structural deficit. First thing we're going to look at is we're going to take input and recommendations from people in this meeting and from the public who's watching. We don't purport to have all of the good ideas needed to fix this broken business. We're going to prepare and present staff recommendations to the Select Board for rate changes and operational adjustments. I want to talk about what I mean by that. Operational adjustments. Sure, we should charge for recycling when the town has a direct expense, but we should also be looking at what people are putting out on their curb. We have fairly clear evidence of people coming from out of town to drop things off in front of people's homes. Why? Is nobody talking about that? Because they don't get charged for it. We've got examples of couches, bureaus, microwaves, washing machines, just dropped off in front of homes of the citizens of Stoughton. And no one's policing it because there's no downside to them. We need help from the community in policing what gets put in front of their home. We've got examples, not many, but a few, of some residents bundling their trash in front of one person's home. So only one family is getting the bill, but a bunch of families are bundling. And not a bunch of examples like that, which I'm happy to see, but more examples than you realize from out-of-town people dropping big-ticket items off in front of people's homes, or out-of-town people dropping things off on the side of the road, send it to Stoughton, they don't charge anything. So we're going to look at how we can change that operational approach to solid waste management. The Board of Selectmen, once they have the staff recommendations, will vote a series of recommendations which will authorize rate and operational adjustments. We're going to amend the FY24 solid waste budget expectations. We're not going to change the budget. The budget's done. We're just going to internally change our own expectations. In FY24, which begins July 1st, we would love to get this business on the way to breaking even, if not break it even in FY24. That's going to be a policy decision of the Select Board. But we're going to change our expectations. $1 million deficit is unacceptable and unsustainable. We're going to consider converting the business unit to an enterprise fund for a number of different business reasons. And finally, we're going to start doing a feasibility study to build a Stoughton transfer facility so we can handle trash and recyclables efficiently. Right now, we can't find a more inefficient model than we're using. You drop it off to us, we dispose of it at an expense and don't pass it on to anybody. We can't process recyclables or waste efficiently because we don't have the transfer station capacity to do that. So we're going to look at all of those operational adjustments that we can make to minimize the structural deficit, and we're going to make a very strong, determinative recommendation on rate increases on simple trash, and we're going to suggest a rate structure. So if people want to bring large ticket items to the DPW facility on Mondays, that they can do that, we'll handle it at whatever our direct cost is for disposing of it for them. Remember, we're not a disposal facility, we're not a transfer station. So when people bring it to us, we have to bring it somewhere. So we're going to be making a comprehensive staff recommendation to the Select Board for them to consider, and then that policy will be determined on May 2nd by the Select Board. That's our presentation. We'd love to open it up to any questions people have. And if you have a question, please ask it, because I'm sure people at home have questions that you're thinking of. No question is out of bounds. Yes, sir.
What's the town's policy on...
Ed, grab that. Ed, grab that microphone, please.
Thank you. Thanks, Lou. What's the town's policy on disposal of mattresses and that type of material? Because I know there's a new law now that, you know, it's pretty tough on that. Are we handling that too? What are we doing there?
Ed, I'll leave how we dispose of them to Paul in just a second, but the current operating procedure is we send a truck around, a pickup truck, and pick up mattresses? No. You put it in the truck?
They bring them to us.
Okay, they bring the mattress to us. That has changed recently. They bring the mattress to us, and we dispose of it at our expense. And where do we send it, Paul?
That's correct. They bring a mattress to us. We confirm they are indeed a trash customer. We'll take the mattress. The mattress costs $21.50 to get rid of. It costs $285 a month to rent the trailer, and it costs $425 every trip when we get 60, 70 mattresses for the disposal company based in New Bedford to come and grab those and do whatever they do with them at no additional cost to the resident.
I mean, we all know that this is the best deal that anybody could have. And
Except the town.
when they made that agreement years ago, it has proven to be great throughout the years, and it's been a while. Last thing I was going to ask, on the mattresses, a lot of people don't have the means to get it from A to B unless they have a pickup truck. Do we do anything for those situations? In other words, they may not be able to get it from their house. to the town's facility?
We do not. We don't make special accommodations. If they call the office and were to tell us maybe they have some difficulty doing it, we could certainly make arrangements. I don't believe there's been any, definitely not many, but if any of those situations, I believe everyone has been able to bring it to us.
Lastly, can you tell us what other types of material are in that same class as mattresses?
So I believe what you're referring to is on November 1st, 2022, the state mandated that mattresses, textiles, clothing, stuff like that would no longer be accepted at disposal facilities. So shoes, clothing, any sort of textile and mattresses.
Some of that, incidentally, some of that stuff, we at the Lions Club collect some of those items, especially going into the winter, shoes, clothing. So we're trying to help.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bill?
I just wanted to mention, if anybody's watching at home, please feel free to email us. If you have any technical questions on the solid waste sanitation department, please email Paul Jaffoon, that's P-G-I, F as in Frank, F as in Frank, U-N-E, at Stoughton-ma.gov. If you have any financial questions, please email me on either the solid waste or the water sewer. That's Bill Rowe, that's W-R-O-W-E, at Stoughton-ma.gov. And if you have any technical questions on the water and sewer operations, you'd be welcome to email Phil McNulty. That's P-M-C-N-U-L-T-Y at Stoughton-ma.gov. May take a few days to get back to you with an answer, but we will get back to you. Thank you.
Well done, Bill. Thank you. Other questions, folks? Mr. Gito, do you have any other questions? No. Cynthia, any other questions? Any questions?
Oh, I'm saving my ammunition for the public hearing.
Thank you. All right, well, listen, on behalf of the panel, we want to thank you for your patience and for your interest and your involvement. And to members of the public, I do hope that you take Mr. Rowe up on his offer to call folks directly, get any answers, any questions answered that you may have. And all I ask is that this is a fact-finding mission. We're going to do a lot of these. We're actually doing a public hearing in a few weeks on how to navigate the town's new website. If there's no information on the street, it's not because we're not presenting it. So we encourage everybody to ask as many questions in the most direct yet civil way possible, and we'll answer them to the best of our ability. And if we don't have the answer, we'll find it and we'll get back to you. We believe as a panel and as a select board that facts are friendly. There's not good facts, there's not bad facts. There are just facts. And it's our job to give you information that is factual so that you, as the governing, as the town meeting body and as citizens of this town, can make informed decisions. And we're committed to doing that. So we thank you and we say good night. Good night, everybody.
Thank you.